In a recent development, OUTA has warned of a looming student accommodation crisis for the upcoming academic year, attributing the issue to NSFAS's slow accreditation pace. Of the 497,000 available beds, only 25,000 have been accredited, raising concerns of widespread shortages. OUTA's Rudie Heyneke has highlighted this sluggish pace. We've reached out to NSFAS to comment on the allegations of a looming student accommodation crisis. NSFAS told The Agenda that they're still studying the report released by OUTA on the matter, and as NSFAS they would only comment after that. But to discuss the implications, we're joined by Asive Dlanjwa, who is spokesperson for the South African Union of Students. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Asive. Good morning to you and welcome to The Agenda.
Good morning, Naledi, to you and also to your viewers and listeners, and thank you for having us.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to certainly hear the concerns of OUTA, to talk about the capacity shortage that we have. NSFAS, of course, waiting for what they are going to say as they continue to study some of the outcomes that OUTA has offered. But as students yourselves, is there a real concern around accrediting student accommodation as we go into the 2024 academic year?
Yes, there are concerns around that. Firstly, generally we have a crisis of student accommodation in South Africa. And one of the measures or the interventions which we had agreed with NSFAS would have been around the accrediting of student accommodation, because some of the problems that we've had, for instance, is student accommodation that does not meet the minimum standards, that has led to students being victims either of crime or etc. So the accreditation process was a critical intervention, and the pace, unfortunately, at which the scheme has moved on this case has been very minimal. And the report of OUTA would be correct that it's less than 10% of beds totally that have been accredited. But we do not. But you must understand that does not represent the capacity of beds in the sector generally. So we don't think it'll be that much of a crisis, owing to the fact that there is already student accommodation that has been used, that is accredited by institutions themselves and not necessarily NSFAS. So the rate at which NSFAS was supposed to do the job, seemingly they've failed up until this point in time. However, we still have credible student accommodation that is still accredited by institutions, because an intervention we had come with from 2019 up to a point where NSFAS would have the capacity to accredit was that institutions must accredit themselves, the institutions, such that these accommodations meet them. So that accommodation is still in the system. We don't think there will be a crisis as far as that is concerned.
Okay, so that's a more optimistic view that you're putting to us, but this is what we've heard from OUTA, is that they've then highlighted alleged tender irregularity at NSFAS in its investigative report. I mean, what do you make of that finding? Inherently,
OUTA are scavengers, so you would appreciate and that they will be alarmist and sensational, because take for instance now, to the common sense and to the right thinking individual, anyone, they must ask themselves, if NSFAS says they've only accredited 6% of beds, it means where were students sleeping this year and all these other years? It means there was accommodation. And as I've said, what was a critical intervention would have been the fact that the institutions are themselves accrediting that institution, one. So secondly, on the issue of tenders, etc., we agree to the extent to which where there's been maleficence or corruption pertaining either to the student accommodation or any processes that involve the monies of taxpayers, the law must take its course, investigations must be done. But here they are conflating two issues. The issue of the tender irregularities, for instance, that they speak about in the report, or they allude to as it pertains to the direct payment system, has no impact on this. On the issue of as far as the report, when I read it, what they are bemoaning and they're crying about is the capacity of the companies that have been appointed. But what we are dealing with here, for instance, that the rate of accommodation that NSFAS had, that 6% rate, is not a reflection on the companies that have been appointed. They might have been appointed irregularly, we do not know, but it is a reflection of what we could say a rejection of the platform by service
Okay,
providers.
So I see what you're doing here, right? You're essentially saying, well, they're looking at just one facet where there are so many opportunities for us to create beds for students. But as the South African Union of Students, I'm sure you've seen this as well, that whether you go to some of the bigger universities or some of the smaller universities in the country, we have had issues, particularly at the beginning of the year, where you see students sleeping in libraries, in foyers. So let's talk about whether or not, from the student point of view, not about who's signing off and who's accrediting beds, but do we have a critical shortage of beds for students?
We do. And you characterize it correctly when you say critical shortage. It is indeed a critical shortage. By our estimation, we have about, in fact, all institutions put together, there's about only 30% of beds that are within institutions of higher learning, and the other 70% is outside and the students at the mercy sometimes of greedy service providers where they begin to live in exorbitant accommodations that does not even meet the minimum standard. So we do have that, and that is more a government problem at large, where government has failed to raise and the infrastructure of student accommodation at the rate at which students are entering institutions of higher learning. So if you look at the enrollment rates, in fact, between 2018 and now, they've almost doubled, you understand. So, and yet student accommodation has remained critically low. So we do have a problem with that. And so this is why we had hoped that we could partner with the private sector to say that based on the ability of them to provide student accommodation, government must come in to accredit them and give the service providers a contract such that we can bolster the lack of student accommodation. Now, what has led, we must characterize what has led to some of the strikes, for instance, in the beginning of the year. What we would find, for instance, is that NSFAS students, their funding would not be concluded in time, and they will not receive their allowances in time. That albeit there might be accommodation, but because their processes have not been concluded, they end up having to sleep outside because they do not have funding. That has been probably one of the biggest causes for students not to have accommodation in the beginning.
And would it then be wrong for me to then say that it sounds to me like the South African Union of Students and OUTA hold a very similar perspective, where the need for beds is recognized by both structures?
Absolutely, that we agree on. The only problem, I suppose, it is the motivation between the two organizations that will differ. But we agree on the principle that students must have student accommodation.
So the reason why I ask that is because at the heart of this really is the most vulnerable person who's right in the center of this issue, and that is the first-year student who's going to start her tertiary education next year, excited at this point, but doesn't know where he or she will be laying their head. So what role then is the South African Union of Students, as representatives of students, then playing to tackle this big challenge?
We are engaging with the department, which is one of our primary stakeholders, and NSFAS and institutions through USAF. What we are bringing as a solution is what we have called for several years to say that the students that are affected by this crisis the most is the poor and the working class, as you rightfully allude, especially because there is an incoherence and incongruence between the systems of government and the systems of institution, whereby we are saying NSFAS only concludes their processes around March, April, while universities conclude their processes around January, February, leaving the poor and the working class students in the gap. We have called for this for years, and the government and the department really does not seem to get it right, to say we must find congruence between the systems. So as some of the practical solutions that we have afforded to the department ourselves as the union, we have said all students who have applied for NSFAS and who have been approved to get NSFAS but they have not received their payments, those students must be allowed, first they must be given first preference for residences in institutions, because universities, often what they do is that they give first preference to self-paying students, leaving the poor and the working class to fend for themselves outside. So we say accommodation inside universities and colleges, first preference must be given to NSFAS applicants, because based on the means test, these are poor and the working class, and that they so that we know at the very least that although their funding has not been concluded, but by the virtue of the fact that NSFAS has deemed them indeed to be poor and qualifying, they must be given accommodation. This is one of the critical interventions we have. We have said the department working with universities must have a food security program for the first 3 months, because NSFAS for the past 7 years has failed to get their systems in order within the first 3 months of the academic year to ensure that these students, at least we know that they have accommodation and also they have food. So these are some of the critical, we would have obviously published some of them about 2 weeks ago. The public can look at that, but these are some of the most critical ones which we have afforded the department to deal with.
Asive, we really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Asive Dlanjwa, a spokesperson for the South African Union of Students. Of course, he's come in there to really give their perspective on the report, of course, that has been released by the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, where, according to the report, of the 497,000 beds available for university students, only 25,000 have been accredited, which has raised concern about widespread shortages, and of course accredited by NSFAS, that is. And a quick reminder that we have reached out to NSFAS to comment on the allegations of that looming student accommodation crisis. They've told the agenda that they're still studying that report by OUTA, and that they would comment after that.